Good morning, colleagues. It's a great honor to join you today for the 13th International Congress of the International Society for Applied Psycholinguistics. I would like to begin by thanking the Congress Chair, Professor Juliana Novo-Gomez, the Society's Organizing and Scientific Committee, Professor Grigory Kazakov, who organized our Symposium, Recent Trends in Polyglot Studies, and all Congress participants watching this session. My presentation is titled Entering Conversational Practice in German through AI Tutors, the Hyperintensive Method Study. It presents an experiment investigation whether a careful design system of AI tutors can replace human language partners during the first functional stage of speaking development. As a researcher of language learning practices and methodologies, at the time I began the experiment, I was not aware of documented cases in which a learner had developed spoken ability from an almost zero level using exclusively AI tutors, with a verifiable language outcome. There are many examples of AI being used as a supplementary tool in language learning, but substantially less evidence regarding AI functioning as the sole provider of linguistic input and conversational interaction. This made the research question quite concrete. Is it possible to enter conversational practice in a foreign language, starting from an almost zero level, using only AI tutors, and not within an unlimited time frame, but through a hyperintensive method aimed at achieving a clearly operational communicative result? The broader question is whether AI can provide sufficient interaction, feedback, and communicative pressure for speaking ability to begin developing. This experiment continues the line of research surrounding the hyperintensive method that I developed during the project 10 Languages in 1000 Days. Professor Dina Nikulicheva presented her observations on that project at the 12th the International Society of Applied Psycholinguistics International Congress, held in June 2021, and later discussed it in the 2022 Signio article, Waves of Intensity in Language Learning, Polyglot Alan Bigulov's project 10 Languages in 1000 Days. She also published a separate study based on her own experience, testing the strategy of hyperintensive entry into conversational practice. These publications provide important methodological context for the present study. The current experiment does not introduce the hyperintensive approach from the beginning. Rather, it addresses a new question within the same methodological tradition. Can the hyperintensive method be effectively adapted when human tutors and native speakers are replaced during the learning phase exclusively by AI tutors? In order to evaluate whether AI tutors could support entry into conversational practice, the experiment adapted the core principles of the hyperintensive method to an AI-mediated environment. The method is based on several interconnected components: periods of controlled hyperintensive immersion, student-operated learning, the tutor functioning as a language sparring partner, the use of a personal conversational course, and the concept of a linguo-communicative situation. Hyperintensive immersion involves concentrated daily speaking-oriented practice, typically 3 to 5 hours per day over approximately 10 days, with alternating periods of high and lower intensity. The learning process is student-led. The learner takes initiative, directs the lesson, and follows a structured communicative plan rather than relying on teacher-driven instruction. Within this framework, the tutor functions primarily as a language sparring partner rather than as a traditional lecturer, sustaining interaction through live responses, corrections, prompts, and conversational support. Vocabulary and grammar are acquired through immediate communicative use and contextual correction during lessons and through work with the personal conversational course. The methodological question in this experiment was whether AI tutors could perform these functions sufficiently effectively to support the initial development of spoken interaction in a foreign language. In the hyperintensive method, entry into conversational practice represents the first operational stage of spoken language development. It refers to the ability to maintain a 30-minute conversation with an unfamiliar native speaker without long pauses, without switching into the learner's native language, and without causing significant communicative discomfort for the interlocutor. The conversation is a genuinely spontaneous interaction. Topics are not agreed upon in advance. Communicative comfort means that the learner possesses sufficient active vocabulary to sustain the interaction, understands the interlocutor well enough to follow the conversation, does not produce errors that block comprehension, and can resolve communicative difficulties within the target language itself. The experiment was originally planned for 100 days, beginning on December 1st, 2024. In practice, however, the target outcome was reached earlier, on January 31st, 2025, meaning that the active learning phase lasted 62 days. My spoken German at the outset was close to zero. I had previously attempted to study German years earlier through a non-hyperintensive approach, but I had no meaningful speaking experience, and my active vocabulary was limited to a small number of common words. The central methodological principle of the experiment was the isolation of the AI factor. No human teachers, no human language partners, no textbooks, no grammar manuals, and no conventional learning resources during the learning phase. All interaction and practice were conducted through AI platforms. The total logged learning time amounted to 131 hours, including 52.5 hours of targeted oral practice. I created an ecosystem of AI tutors using chatbot platforms and 11 labs for voice interaction. Across the experiment, I created approximately 30 tutor versions, while the final working ecosystem consisted of 21 specialized tutors. 10 academic tutors were created primarily for vocabulary expansion, lexical development, and topic-based language enrichment. 11 were community tutors designed to simulate ordinary native speakers in informal conversation. For each tutor, I prepared detailed documentation, including biographical and professional profiles, lesson behavior algorithms, methodological instructions, and principles for conducting student-operated lessons. This diversity was intended to avoid the perception of interacting with a single faceless system and to create a wider range of communicative situations. I would like to invite you to watch a 1-minute excerpt from one of my lessons with AI tutors. Activate Leonie.
Guten Tag, Alan Bigulov. Schön, Sie zu sehen. Ich bin Dr. Eichmann. Bereit für unsere Deutschstunde? Ich habe mich schon ein wenig über Ihr Interesse an der KI-gestützten Sprachlernerfahrung informiert. Wie geht's Ihnen heute?
Mir geht es gut, danke. Es freut mich auch, Sie kennenzulernen und mit Ihnen Deutsch zu üben. Heute ich möchte mit Ihnen erste Frage von Dokument Short Experiment zu üben. Können Sie bitte erste Frage zu lesen?
Das freut mich sehr zu hören, Alan. Es ist mir auch eine Freude, Sie kennenzulernen und Sie beim Deutschlernen zu unterstützen. Gerne lese ich die erste Frage für Sie vor. Sie stammt aus dem Abschnitt über das Experiment. Hier ist die Frage auf Englisch. What was Alan's primary goal for his AI-powered language learning experiment?
I tracked all learning activity over the 2-month period in order to obtain objective time data. The total amounted to 131 hours. As the graph shows, the process was not linear. It followed the wave-like structure of the hyperintensive method, periods of high-intensity practice followed by lower-intensity consolidation phases. The first intensive wave focused primarily on basic structures, vocabulary acquisition, and learning to manage the AI tutoring process itself. The second wave focused on voice interaction and preparation for conversations with native speakers in real communicative settings. Of the total time, 52.5 hours consisted specifically of oral practice with AI tutors. This distinction is important because the method is based not only on total study time, but on concentrated conversational pressure. This slide illustrates the transition from text-based work during the first weeks of the experiment to later voice-based practice. After the first 2 weeks, my spoken ability was still only at an embryonic stage. Text interaction helped me organize lessons, develop tutor prompts, and build foundational learning material. But speaking ability began to develop seriously only after I moved to sustained voice interaction with AI tutors. The most effective tutor versions were developed after the new year. At that point, it became possible to organize a series of productive voice-based lessons, and the growth of speaking ability became proportional both to the number of oral practice hours and to the quality of the tutor design. For beginners, meta-communication is crucial. The learner must be able to manage the lesson before becoming capable of speaking fluently in the target language. During the experiment, I used English for meta-communication with the AI tutors. In this experiment, I devoted greater attention to evaluation procedures than in my earlier language learning experiments. The results were assessed from several perspectives: native speakers, independent experts in German language teaching, self-observation, and computer-assisted linguistic analysis of dialogue transcripts. 2 experts in German language teaching monitored my progress from the first week of the experiment. Both followed my Telegram experiment diary, and I also had several online meetings with them at different stages of the study. At times, they spontaneously switched to German during our conversations, which gave them a direct impression of my developing speaking ability prior to the final conversations with native speakers. By the end of January, I felt ready to test the result with real native speakers. On January 31st, the 62nd day of the experiment, I scheduled 6 45-minute free conversation sessions on italki with different unfamiliar German speakers. None of them knew me, my methodology, or how long I had been studying German. The conversations began spontaneously and covered a range of topics, including small talk, travel, hobbies, and more complex discussion of the experiment itself. From the first minute, I spoke exclusively in German and did not switch to English. In total, this was my first real experience speaking with native German speakers, and it lasted approximately 4 hours across the day. After the first conversation, I already understood that entry into conversational practice had occurred. The remaining conversations further confirmed it. Each final conversation lasted approximately 40 minutes and was conducted in German. At the end, the interlocutors provided brief feedback in English. Their evaluations were remarkably consistent. They assessed the speaking performance as being approximately at the B1 level rather than A2, and emphasized that the interaction was sufficiently comfortable and natural to be sustained. I subsequently provided recordings of these conversations to independent experts for evaluation. Their conclusions closely aligned with the impressions of the native speakers. They noted the relative fluency of the speech, the absence of a strong language barrier, and the learner's willingness to communicate as a major strength. For the purposes of this study, the key point is the convergence of these evaluations. Native speakers, independent experts, and my own observations all pointed toward the same overall outcome. Alongside qualitative feedback, I also conducted a quantitative analysis of my speech in conversations with native speakers and language experts. For this purpose, I developed a computer program for the linguistic analysis of German dialogue transcripts. The input consisted of transcripts containing only the learner's utterances extracted from the dialogues. The output was a text-based report including several dozen metrics, such as lexical analysis, syntactic analysis, discourse features, fluency indicators, readability measures, filler words, and hesitation markers. Across the analyzed spontaneous conversations conducted over a 2-month period, the program identified a total of 1,060 unique lemmas as determined by Spacey and TextStat. This made it possible, for the first time within this line of research, to document the hyper-intensive learning outcome not only qualitatively through human feedback, but also quantitatively through comparable transcript-based data. These charts show changes in conversation duration, average segment length, unique lemmas, hesitation markers, readability, and syntactic complexity. The overall pattern suggests that speech became more extended and structurally complex, while the learner retained the ability to sustain interaction. Readability scores decreased, which in this context indicates that the utterances became more complex in terms of vocabulary and grammatical structure. Dependency depth also increased. These metrics do not, by themselves, prove fluency. However, they support the same interpretation reached by the human evaluators. The final conversations were not rehearsed fragments, but spontaneous speech demonstrating measurable lexical and syntactic development. To determine whether the result was merely a short-term effect of the hyper-intensive period, I conducted a delayed control conversation 3 months after the conclusion of the main experiment. During those 3 months, there was a complete break from German practice. On May 1st, 2025, I held a conversation with an unfamiliar native speaker, Maya. Before the conversation, she was informed that it formed part of the experiment and agreed to complete a feedback questionnaire afterward. The conversation lasted 57 minutes. The questionnaire consisted of 27 items based on the hyper-intensive methods criteria for conversational practice. The result was significant. The level of entry into conversational practice was preserved without any obvious loss of active vocabulary. Fluency was slightly reduced and some grammatical issues remained, particularly with verb placement. But these difficulties were minor and did not substantially affect the overall quality of communication. A separate result of the experiment concerns the psycholinguistic experience of prolonged interaction with AI tutors. At first, the interaction can feel surprisingly natural, especially when high-quality voice models and carefully designed tutor personas are used. However, during sustained intensive practice, I observed a cumulative, uncanny valley-like effect. This was not a visual phenomenon, but rather a communicative and emotional one. The tutor simulates encouragement, interest, and empathy, yet over time, the learner gradually perceives the absence of genuine personal experience or reciprocal human presence behind the voice. This may produce a sense of emotional emptiness or mechanical exchange and can reduce motivation once the initial novelty diminishes. From the perspective of AI language learning design, this is not merely a minor cosmetic issue. Intensive speaking practice depends heavily on attention, emotional engagement, and interpersonal trust. Therefore, AI tutors require compensatory strategies, greater persona variation, more natural turn-taking dynamics, less repetitive questioning patterns, explicit lesson protocols, and in many cases, hybrid interaction with human teachers or speakers. The experiment revealed both the advantages and the limitations of AI tutors. The advantages are clear: 24-hour availability, flexible scheduling, the possibility of customizing tutors to a specific methodology, reduced social pressure, analytical feedback, and significantly lower practice costs compared to regular human tutoring. With careful prompting, AI tutors can also discuss complex and abstract topics, rather than being limited to simple textbook dialogues. However, important weaknesses also became apparent. AI tutors often tend to adopt an interview-like interaction style, repeatedly asking questions instead of participating as equal conversational partners. They require constant methodological guidance. Most importantly, they lack genuine emotional presence, cultural experience, and human reciprocity. During prolonged intensive interaction, this may produce an uncanny valley-like sense of emotional emptiness or mechanical exchange. The practical conclusion is not that AI tutors should replace human teachers. Rather, a more realistic interpretation is that AI tutors can serve as powerful infrastructure for intensive language practice, particularly in situations where access to native speakers or teachers is limited, or where learners need to develop spoken ability rapidly. The method may be especially valuable for self-directed learners with clearly defined goals, or when implemented under methodological supervision. For developers, the experiment suggests several important requirements: diverse tutor personas, explicit behavioral protocols, support for metacommunication, high-quality voice interaction, and integrated progress analytics. For researchers, the next step is replication with larger samples, different language pairs, and hybrid models that combine AI-based interaction with the emotional, cultural, and social depth provided by human communication. To conclude, the experiment provided a positive answer to the central research question. In this documented N1 case, entry into conversational practice was achievable using AI tutors alone, starting from an almost zero level in German. The hyperintensive method proved adaptable to AI-mediated language learning, and the outcome was supported through conversations with native speakers, evaluations by independent experts, transcript-based metrics, and a 3-month follow-up. However, this should not be interpreted as a universal claim. The method requires substantial technical and methodological preparation, a high degree of self-discipline, and psychological readiness for intensive interaction with non-human interlocutors. AI tutors are a highly effective instrument, especially for learners with clear goals, but they cannot fully replace human interaction in its emotional, cultural, and social dimensions. Thank you for your attention.